Thank you. Thank you, Becky, and welcome everyone. I see we have some 43 people coming in from different places. I don't know where you are. I am coming to you from Faculty Superblock here at NYU, which sits on unceded Lenape land. Let me give a couple of thank yous and acknowledgments as we get the program started tonight. I wanted to even though Zoom is a magical technology, it does take a fair amount of work, logistic and otherwise, and I wanted to acknowledge the people who made tonight's meeting possible. So Jennifer Burge, Andy DeSocio, Rachel Plutzer, Mike West, and especially Becky Amato, whom you've heard from, have done a lot of work. So as Becky said, this is one of 4 webinars that we're putting together. The Urban Democracy Lab is a small center housed at the Gallatin School with the New York University. And we've been around for 5 years. Our mission is to create a space of dialogue for civil society, social movements, practitioners, activists, and scholars on what a just urban future can look like. One of the things we've worked on a lot these last 4 or 5 years actually has been the question of housing, which, as people know, is one of the central social justice issues here in the city of New York. And we were caught by surprise, like most of us, most of you, with this COVID crisis, and we're wanting to respond. Like most of you, I've had this feeling of trying to be, what does it mean to be useful at this time? And one of the things we're trying to do in this series is actually highlight one part of the public discussion, one very important part of the public discussion that's not quite making its way to the New York Times and Washington Post and NPR, which is we wanted to hear from people who are frontline organizers at this time. One of the biggest lies about the COVID crisis is that it's an equal opportunity virus. The virus may infect biological beings the same, but the opportunity is so socially different. Depending on race, class, physical location, the conditions of your housing, and so on. And what has emerged in the last 2 or 3 weeks has been a lot of very, very exciting organizing. So tonight, we're going to be talking to people who are some of these awesome organizers. Next week, on the 14th, we have a follow-up event with a friend of the labs, Raquel Ronick, who was the UN rapporteur on housing as a human right, along with Sia and another of UDL longtime friends, Daniel Aldana Cohen. That event is co-sponsored by Verso Books and NYC DSA. Oh, and I forgot to mention tonight's event, and the whole series is co-sponsored by the Department of Labor and Urban Studies at the School of Labor and Urban Studies at CUNY. And the following, we have one on April 16th on labor justice, where we're going to hearing from people organizing from hand to hand, from the Street Vendor Project, and someone from Amazonians United. And we have one more event after that about immigrant justice at this time. So final thing I wanted to mention before I introduced our speakers, who are very generous, who are all extremely busy with organizing right now to share with us. I wanted to mention that this week we lost housing analyst Tom Waters due to COVID. He worked with Oksana, maybe she will talk about him, but he was a very important person here in New York City, and we're very sad to have lost him. So let me introduce tonight's speakers. It is no surprise that it is kick-ass women who are coming to speak with us, because it is kick-ass women who are playing such an important role in the housing struggles here in New York. First up is going to be Sia Weaver. She's campaign coordinator for Housing Justice for All, formerly known as the Upstate Downstate Alliance. And in 2019, the Alliance, which includes over 70 grassroots advocacy organizations, won the strongest tenant protections New York State has seen in a long time. So we're very happy and proud to have you with us tonight, Sia. Thank you so much for coming. After Sia, we're going to turn over to Oksana Mironova. She's a housing policy analyst with the Community Service Society, where Tom Waters used to work. She researches and advocates for housing policies that benefit low-income New Yorkers and works in coalition with grassroots organizations. And her research in particular focuses on publicly subsidized, privately owned housing and current issues impacting low-income New Yorkers, including displacement, evictions, and homelessness. And after that, we're going to turn to Urban Democracy Lab visiting scholar, friend, and former doctoral fellow, Sarah Dubisak, who among many other accomplishments is one of the important members of the Crown Heights Tenant Union. She earned her PhD in sociology from NYU in September 2019. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Sia. I will see you on the other side.
See you on the other side. Thank you for that introduction, and I'm happy to be here today. And, you know, I am thankful to be in this moment and to have, you know, my health and employment, and it's really a crazy time for so many of us. So I want to second that Tom was a really important person to the housing justice movement, and it's really sort of shocking to be in this moment where of this like such pain and fear. So I want to tell you first a little bit about the Housing Justice for All Alliance and campaign. So we came together in October of 2017, and we are a statewide coalition of over 70 organizations that represent tenants, tenants in public housing and private housing, and homeless New Yorkers across the entire state of New York. And what we do is we sort of have built a statewide network where groups that are doing grassroots organizing on the ground, like the Crown Heights Tenant Union and others, and we have created a statewide network for grassroots groups to be sort of pushing a statewide policy and agenda in Albany. In 2017 and 18 and 19, we worked very hard to pass what became the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act of 2019. And in 2020, we've been working hard to figure out where do we go from there, and how can we start to fight for, like, what does it mean? I think we say a lot in housing organizing and in sort of not even just on the left. I think a lot of people will say now housing is a human right. I don't really know what that means, because lots of people say that who actually don't mean it. Lots of people say housing is a human right, and what they mean is we should set aside like 20% of any given building to people who make 130% of AMI, because like housing is a human right. So we're trying to push beyond that, and we're trying to really think about like what would it mean to truly organize for housing as a human right in New York? How can we build a network that can be stronger than the sum of its parts, that can connect people who live in Buffalo with people who live in Long Island, and like address like the sort of toxic role that the real estate industry has played in New York politics for centuries. The New York real estate industry is probably the most politically potent and powerful industry in our state. And so by coming together, we really think that we're trying to sort of like drive them out of politics and drive them out of Albany. And we're doing that in a number of ways. One, we're like really committed to really going on the offensive. We're really trying to like not just say like we want to like make this reform here or that reform there. We're trying to really think about like what's a bold vision, what's like 10 years down the road, what does it mean to really like legislate an advancement towards housing as a human right, and then how do we get there tomorrow? And for us, that means like building alignment between the groups and like what groups' different sort of like visions are, and then figuring out what role legislators can play advancing that in Albany in this moment. And then the third thing is like constant targeting of the real estate industry and the toxic influence that they have on our political system. So that is who we are. And again, we represent 70 groups across the state who do lots of different types of work in this movement. Some of them are fully grassroots groups like the CHTU, which has like no staff members. Some of them are organizing with like 25 staff members across different parts of the state. And some of them are sort of policy advocates and policy allies like Community Service Society, Legal Aid Society, who like help us like articulate our vision and advance it forward. So it's like a big movement, and we try to like really just work directly with tenant leaders and like and homeless New Yorkers and sort of get out of the way and like build the infrastructure for groups to do the work themselves. So I say that all to say that to the extent that like we are in a crazy moment right now. We're in a crazy moment where really big things can happen. That was true last year around rent laws expiring, and we were like, wow, this is like a really important historical moment. Tons of people are renting, tons of people are homeless. We have an opportunity. The rent laws are expiring. We have an opportunity to bring people together to push for something aggressive and really win. That is more true now than it was yesterday, and it's more true than it's been probably in 10 years or maybe even longer than that. Right now, in this moment, more people are receptive to this idea that no one should be evicted and that no one's rent should really go up than ever before. To give a little bit of context to what I mean when I say that, about 2 weeks ago, the Housing Justice for All mailing list had about 6,000 people on it. Today, our mailing list has over 100,000 people on it. So that means that like a lot of people are turning to our message about like, what does it mean for housing to be a human right? Why should we not really be evicted? Like the idea that, you know, we've been saying in the housing justice community for a long time that everyone is just one paycheck away from an eviction, or everyone is just one life event. My mom got sick, or I lost my job, or my car broke down, or whatever, away from being evicted. What's happening under COVID right now is that life event that is causing so many of us to lose our homes is happening to all of us at once in a terrifying and scary way. So as millions and millions and millions of people apply for and are unable to get unemployment, millions and millions of people are like, wait, it's like possible for my landlord to just throw me out of my home? That really seems unfair. So our message that we can live in a New York without evictions, and we can live in a New York where tenants have the right to stay in their homes, is actually, we're in a moment of like ideological shift on like who should be able to control housing. And it's not actually the people who quote unquote own it, it's the people who live there. To be a little rambly. So this is actually for us, as much as it is a scary moment, it's a moment of opportunity, and it's a moment where we have to sort of be bold and really demand things that 2 weeks ago felt completely impossible. As much as it is also that moment, it also is a moment that's characterized by fear, right? So at the same time as there's like immense political possibility and opportunity, we have Governor Cuomo who's pushing forward the worst state budget we've had in decades. The state budget really leaves homeless people to die. There's no way around that. It is that violent. It cuts funding to Medicaid. It refuses to fund public housing, and public housing actually needs deep services right now. So at the same time as like millions of people are turning to the housing justice movement to look for like support and to look for like a different vision for our society, we have a political system that is really like entrenching itself and saying like, we need to cut things, we need to like force through austerity, we need to protect the real estate industry. The Trump administration forced through a federal stimulus budget that allows landlords to write down presumed losses on their property, like the total cost like $140 billion, I think. So those are like the political contradictions that are characterizing this moment, and it's really incumbent on us as organizers to like step up to the plate and to offer something different and to like create a movement that can welcome a lot of people in. And that's really challenging, right? Because this moment is like, how do you have a moment that doesn't lose the 2,000 people who are already fighting with us while bringing in like the 80,000 people who want to fight with us now, and still stay in touch with the tenant leaders who are doing like the really critical work that needs to be the building block of this moment, which is talking to your neighbors in the place where you live. So how do we not just like, we need to go online, but we can't just be on Twitter all the time. It needs to be better than that. So that's a challenge, and that's the opportunity. So I want to just say like a little bit about like what we have been doing, and potentially like ways that folks on this call can plug, or on this webinar, on this meeting can plug in. So we started early on organizing with the Right to Counsel Coalition, which has also really expanded access to free legal services for New Yorkers, organizing to close housing courts. So early on in the COVID crisis, we were able to win one of the strongest eviction moratoriums in the country. And it's an eviction moratorium that cities and states are looking to try and implement where they are. Most states have not done anything to pause evictions, and the eviction moratorium coming from the federal government is not nearly as strong as the one that we have in New York. So in New York right now, housing courts are closed unless you are a tenant who is affirmatively bringing a case against your landlord about like conditions or an illegal lockout. So early on, in the early days of a week ago or 2 weeks ago, we won this eviction moratorium. And since then, we've been fighting for three main things, sort of at like an escalation of one, like, what do we need to do in this moment? But then two, what do we need to do for the next 6 months? And then three, like, what does like a just recovery that means a massive expansion of social housing really look like? So we're fighting right now to cancel the rent. So we think that the rent that is being accrued during this moment shouldn't ever be owed during this moment. So the eviction moratorium protects us while we're in this crisis, but if we don't take action to halt evictions for the long term, if we don't take action to sort of like wipe out this debt that will have accrued, we're gonna see like a never before experienced like tidal wave of evictions when housing court reopens in less than 90 days at this point. I believe it's June 20th. So we're just calling to like basically like our rent jubilee for all rent that's owed and accrued during this crisis. The second thing that we're calling for is to also freeze rents and to immediately rehouse homeless New Yorkers in vacant housing. And so, it's a little silly, like, well, if I'm not paying rent, my rent also shouldn't go up. We actually think that we're going to win something around cancel rent. And I'll talk a little bit about that. My time's almost up, but I'll talk a little bit about that. We think that that landlords are going to try and raise the rent in like August to earn the same amount of money that they can get from in 8 months that they would ordinarily get in 12 months, especially for unregulated renters. So we are calling for like an immediate passage of the good cause eviction bill in the state legislature, but also no rent increases for any tenant for 2 years in order to like keep people in their homes as the public health crisis recedes and the economic crisis like settles into itself. And then the third thing and then we want to sort of rehouse homeless New Yorkers in existing vacant homes with a lease that is like frozen at its current rent, even though you don't have to pay it right now because we want to also cancel the rent. And then the third thing that we want to do, we're calling it Reclaim Our Homes, and that's when we're really talking about like how are we bringing tons and tons and tons of units into like the sort of stock of social housing. So maybe Oksana is going to talk a little bit about like what social housing is and what it means in the New York context. I don't know. But we really think that this is an opportunity that we haven't had since like, the post-World War I or post-World War II or, the 1970s to where the moments when we saw like a vast expansion of the amount of regulated housing in New York to actually like not give away a lot of housing to speculators, to bring a lot of buildings back into a regulatory framework, whether that's not-for-profit, public housing, or controlled by residents themselves through something like a community land trust. We think this is a big opportunity sort of transfer housing out of the speculative real estate market into different sort of non-financial speculation modes. And that's a special moment, but it's also it's a special moment, but we also need to like sort of like keep our eyes on that prize because it will be very easy to not get there, right? If we don't keep our eye on that third bucket, like what we're doing in a just recovery, what will happen is we will see landlords like. There's an article in the Wall Street Journal today about private equity landlords seeing this as an opportunity to buy a lot of distressed buildings. That's what we saw happen in 2008. The housing market crashed in 2008, and the reaction was like and that's when I sort of first started doing tenant organizing in New York, and when I met Sarah in the Crown Heights Tenant Union. That the private equity industry just used that as an opportunity to sort of consolidate more ownership and more ownership. So I really feel like in the tenant movement that like we're working with, we really feel like we have an opportunity to go down one of two paths right now. And path one is like a big expansion of decommodified housing, and path two is a further consolidation in the private equity market. And that is a really overwhelming time, but it's also very cool. And I really do believe in like the amount of people who are open to our idea and the amount of people who are really like, it is unjust to face eviction, it is unjust to have to pay rent, means that we can really demand big things. I have 1 minute left, so I just want to say like a little bit about what we're doing to get there. So in order to win our demands, we are circulating a petition to Governor Cuomo. It's got a bunch of signatures. It would be great if the folks on the webinar could sign it. So I can send the link in the chat in a bit, but it's the bit.ly that is no rent NY. Once you sign it, we want people to tell their COVID housing story. We're trying to figure out how people can feel less alone in this moment when millions of us have lost our jobs and our income. And so we have built in support from Just Fix NYC in New York City DSA, we have a story map where people can upload their stories about what's happening in their housing because of COVID, including a picture. And then we're sort of visually representing that. And then the third thing that we're asking folks to do is to talk to their neighbors. We put together a rent strike toolkit to guide you in that process of talking to your neighbors, even in a time of social isolation. We did that again, all of this with the Right to Counsel NYC coalition. And this is just a moment where we have to step up to the plate and figure out how to organize under less than ideal conditions, right? People have organized under harder conditions and more authoritarian conditions and more life-threatening conditions than this. And so we also have to figure out how to do that, right? We don't have a choice. And then tomorrow or the next day, we are hoping to launch like an official call for a statewide rent strike by May 1st, which is a nice historic date to call for such a thing. So we're going on two tracks. Track one is like tenants organizing in their buildings to demand a rent strike, or to demand our political demands, which is a little unusual for a rent strike. Usually when people are rent striking these days, we're trying to win something directly from the landlord. Now we're trying to go on a mass rent strike to win political demands. So we want to get a bunch of buildings on rent strike directly from to try and win these things from their landlords, to sort of provide the model and to be the face of a statewide rent strike. But we also want, millions of individuals to not pay rent in solidarity behind those tenants who are taking that step, right? So we have both an individual rent strike pledge, and I'm going to talk to my neighbors and go on rent strike in my building pledge that we're planning to launch tomorrow. So you heard it here first. And I think that's what we're working on. Our contact information is on our website and in the chat, so anyone who has questions can get in touch. We're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, we are on the internet, where all of us are these days. So thank you, that's all I have.
Hey everyone, my name is Oksana. I'm a housing policy analyst with the Community Service Society. And I don't know if you all can hear me because it's 7 o'clock and there's lots of stuff going on. A building by me is actually on rent strike. So that's blending in with the clapping for first responders. Cool, all right, awesome. So what I'm gonna talk about is I'm gonna briefly talk about our latest findings on the scale of housing need in New York City, and a little bit about what's in the federal stimulus as well. I did this work with my colleague, Tom Waters, who passed away this weekend. He worked, he's been a fixture in the kind of housing advocacy community in New York City for over 20 years. He worked extensively on the rent laws. He worked extensively on getting rid of 421A, which unfortunately we haven't done yet, and a bunch of other things. So please keep him in your thoughts. And if you knew him and want to make a donation in his memory, his family has asked to direct those donations to Tenants and Neighbors and the Pied Pipers Children's Theater of Inwood. And if you have any questions about that, please just reach out to me. I'm assuming since you're attending this webinar, you probably know that the pandemic has already increased the city has been in a housing crisis for a constant state of housing crisis, but things have gotten especially bad over the last 20 years. So the ongoing housing crisis has been a daily reality for homeless and housing insecure New Yorkers for forever. We know that after decades of climbing housing costs, low-income renters were already experiencing a ton of housing hardships, and some of those you could see on your screen right now, hopefully. So we know in 2019, 30% of low-income New Yorkers, which we identify as people making under 200% of the federal poverty line, 30% fell behind on rent. So that's like the first step towards an eviction. 20% had their utilities shut off because they were unable to pay their bills. 19% had to move in with other people because of financial costs, not because they just wanted to move in with other people. And 15% were threatened with eviction. We also know that the vast majority of low-income renters in the city, 70% have less than $1,000 in savings for an emergency like a job loss or a hospitalization. So, sorry, I'm trying to figure out how to advance my slide. Oh, cool, okay. So when you combine all of that with kind of like the existing levels of housing insecurity in the city, when you combine that with the scale of the pandemic that we have now, and specifically the economic impact of massive job losses within industries like the service sector and other types of precarious types of jobs, you end up with lots of people who are unable to pay their rent. Like that's definitely happening. According to our calculation, there were probably something like 126,000 households who were found it difficult or impossible to pay their rent in April. And I should say that this number is based on some research that CUNY did in the second and third week of March. So that's before all of the kind of like harsh social distancing rules went into effect. So the actual number by now is probably much higher because this doesn't account for everyone who lost their job after March 22nd. So just keep like 126,000 households times 2. That's like the number of people who probably either had trouble or didn't pay their rent in April. So now I'm going to switch over and talk a little bit about the federal housing aid that came in the stimulus or the CARES Act. So what you see on the screen right now are actual federal allocations of money towards major housing programs. And then the second and third row are projections about how much money New York State and New York City are probably going to get. So the first and second column, the homeless assistance or ESG and the flexible community development funding or CDBG, that's money that could be used for things like eviction protection, short-term rental assistance, so not ongoing but short-term, homeless services, rapid rehousing, and CDBG could also be used for certain forms of affordable housing development as well. The third, fourth, and fifth column are funding for households who already live in public, in either public housing, HUD-assisted housing, or receive Section 8 vouchers. So basically, all of that money will go towards covering rent of people who lost their jobs, or towards costs for public housing authorities or private landlords who have contracts with HUD to assist them with the immediate response to the pandemic. So it's like cleaning and doing kind of like immediate emergency response type things. The stimulus package also includes separate pots of money, a specific COVID disaster relief fund, and also money for FEMA, which could also be used for emergency housing assistance as well. So basically, all of this is to say there's some reassurance in the fact that people who already receive federal housing assistance are not necessarily going to lose their housing right now. So basically, if you have a Section 8 voucher and you lose your job, you'll be okay, like for the next couple of months. But the main problem is that the same underlying issues that were already true before the pandemic. So when you take something like NYCHA's $40 billion capital backlog, those things are still going to be true and they're going to get worse. So that's kind of like the big problem with the federal stimulus at this moment. And more broadly, there's really not money in here or from the city or the state to deal with the kind of like the thing that's here already talked about, the fact that renter debt is going to continue to accumulate over the course of the next couple of months. And things are going to continue and getting worse on May 1st and June 1st. People are not going to have money out of somewhere where they're going to be able to make their rent. That's especially people who don't receive a voucher or live in public housing. In addition to that, despite the fact that there's some money in here towards emergency housing assistance for people who are unhoused, and the fact that you could use FEMA, some FEMA funding towards emergency assistance for homeless people, neither the city or the state really have a plan to do that. This money is not enough to address the problem that we have in the city, but despite that, there's no holistic plan at all. So there's things that need to happen immediately. And Sia talked about rent cancellation and a great infusion of public funding in the next stimulus package are like the things that absolutely need to happen now. But we also need a broader reorientation of the way that the public sector deals with housing and long-term, like basically thinking about things like long-term stewardship, public housing, and social housing as well on like a way bigger scale. And by social housing, we're really talking about housing that's not commodified and that's controlled by the people who live there as opposed to landlords who don't. So that's all that I have for my slides, and I think I'm going to hand it over to Sarah.
Hello, everyone. I am Sarah. I'm a member of the Crown Heights Tenant Union, and as Sia already mentioned, we're a rank and file member-run organization in Crown Heights since 2013, and we've been fighting displacement, landlord harassment, lack of repairs, and rent overcharges. And actually, Sia was one of the individuals who helped found the CHTU, so we know Sia well. And we're a union of different tenants associations in Crown Heights, and we have about over 40 buildings who are members of the CHTU. And one of our organizing principles is that we believe that long-term tenants and newer tenants in Crown Heights are being exploited in different ways, but by the very same system of like housing commodification, real estate speculation. And so it's imperative that we all kind of are in this fight together at the neighborhood level and at the city level. And as Sia kind of already pointed out, you know, we weren't anticipating the kind of economic crisis that ensued and then the housing crisis that came as a consequence of it. And I think it was the end of the second week of March where we suddenly get inundated with calls from people, messages, emails saying, what do I do? April 1st is coming. I don't know what to do about my rent. I'm hearing calls for a rent strike. And so I'm going to spend my allocated time to kind of talk about what this has been looking like from the bottom up and what have been building level struggles and what is it looking like for tenants in Crown Heights. And so we are first like inundated with this call, and the first thing that we start to do is telling people who are reaching out to us to build TAs, to talk to their neighbors, find out who's in a similar situation. Because at the CHTU, you know, we really believe in kind of building that collective power from the bottom up. And what's been really amazing for us to see is that just in the past 2.5 to 3 weeks, though it feels like it's already been like 6 weeks or longer, we've seen a huge surge in TAs being built. We're directly working with 25 new TAs almost that developed just in this 2.5 to 3 week period. And I'm pointing this out because it really, I think, points to the fact that tenants who are entering this movement for the first time, they're not just being reactive, they are thinking strategically, They're thinking about how to build power. They're thinking about how to build relationships. And these are the kind of structures we need in place as we kind of try to use this moment to kind of build and win some of our larger demands. And just as some examples of how this is playing out, we had recently some tenants from a neighboring neighborhood that doesn't have a neighborhood tenant-wide union come to us because they are using this moment to actually build a neighborhood tenant union. And that's incredible, right? And then we also have kind of individual tenants who in 2 weeks, like built up a TA. And for those of you who haven't tried to build up a tenants association or a TA, it can be really hard work. But not only do they build up their TA, they then went online, found out what buildings their landlord owns, and tried to go canvass those buildings. And this isn't just like one tenant or two tenants, it's a huge number of tenants who are engaging in this kind of work. So that's been incredibly inspiring. And on top of that, I think what's also incredible is that we had a whole rush of people who haven't been super politically active. Like some of these folks are, maybe they're plugged into the DSA or they are politically active, but we're also working with a large number of people who aren't politically active. And this is the first time that they're interacting, in our case, with a kind of a union setting, right? And thinking about working collectively. How do you build collective power? What does it mean to be in solidarity with one another? And I think it's starting to become like an empowering process for the people who are engaging with that. And so something as simple as folks are learning that you don't have to talk to your landlord one-on-one, that you can set demands on your landlord, and that it makes sense to do it as a TA in a collective, and that increases the power you have as you're talking to your landlord. These are like small little lessons, but I think they're building the foundations of the kind of infrastructure we need to build a larger movement. And it's starting to happen organically. And as a CHTU, we're trying to support that. And one of the ways we've done that we started off by responding to people individually, but as Sia mentioned, we're member run and we don't have the capacity to do that. And we started hosting these weekly Zoom meetings, and we've had 4 so far, where we have 70 to 85 people on the call. And people are, it's a space in which people really realize they're not alone. It's a space in which, as we learn how to use Zoom, teaching people also how to build collective knowledge, right? So using the breakout groups so that people can see that their struggles are similar and you can build collective knowledge and collective strategizing. Because as also an organization, having a robust democratic discussion about these issues is really important to us. But now as kind of things are settling down on the kind of April 1st deadline that we had, we've started kind of thinking about what are some, not obstacles, but what are some things that we have to deal with internally. So one thing, I mentioned the CHTU is really an organization for both long-term residents and newer tenants. And, we've been inundated by calls of mainly younger and newer tenants to our neighborhood. And we've been thinking about how do we ensure that kind of the struggles that we had ongoing before this pandemic are continued, and how do we make sure that the voices that are shaping the discussion are really representative of the community that we live in. And we've just started thinking about it. So one thing, it's like a small little thing and it's a procedural thing, but I think it ends up being an important thing, is on these Zoom calls to make sure that we have more long-term tenants who are represented. We have a few who are coming on, but not everyone. So it's really using our member resources to kind of target those tenants who don't feel comfortable with these platforms and bring them in. But another way is also to kind of think about what happens to the kind of building level fights we were having before the pandemic, right? And how do we integrate them into the discussions that we're having right now? And that for us is like a very useful way to get folks who are new to the movement, who are really focused on the idea of cancel rent, to be able to broaden the discussion to larger issues. So there are kind of 2 ways that we're thinking about it. One is all of these new TAs that have formed. Some of the TAs have been really good about reaching out to long-term tenants. in their buildings, others haven't. So it's using this time now to say, you know, talk to the long-term tenants. What are the issues that they're facing? The organizing can't just be around cancel rent. It has to be around kind of harassment, repair issues, things that people in the building have been facing, and to start having those conversations. On another level, but the same side of the coin is, or the other side of the coin being, we have buildings that were already on rent strike before this pandemic, or we have buildings that have been facing repair issues, harassment issues, and been thinking about going on rent strike. So now it's at the building level to also say, how do we use this moment to kind of leverage the demands that you could win as a tenant organization, right? And highlighting those struggles within these kind of calls that we're having. And then, and tied to this, like another concrete example would be, there's a lot of media interest right now on healthcare workers who are being displaced from their homes because of their exposure to the virus. And so we got a few calls from the media about this, and we talked about this in the CH2, is that, you know, that, for example, that kind of media focus, though important, ignores the reality of so many frontline healthcare workers who already live in toxic conditions, right? Either, so we have a member who is a healthcare worker who has toxic mold in her apartment, who has a super, who engages in verbal and sexual harassment, and talking about how those kind of scenarios and situations people are in are also important to highlight as we're talking about the effects of the pandemic, and not to have a kind of narrow focus on what that means. So that's both organizationally and in the kind of media narratives that are building. So that's the way we've been thinking about how we start connecting what's happening right now, the interests we have, and the kind of infrastructure that is being built, to having these larger discussions about the kind of systematic exploitation that's created the foundations of this crisis, and how do we connect building level struggles to this larger crisis, and so that we can like start having a conversation about what it means to demand social housing, public utilities, ending market-based solutions to the housing crisis. So, you know, even before the pandemic hit, the main thing we were really working on was anti-rezoning efforts, right? And so we really, as we kind of get our bearing, really want to go back to thinking about how do we use this momentum for those kind of struggles as well. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much for these very provocative and very insightful presentations. I thought I would pick up on a couple of themes that actually, maybe not surprisingly, but ran through all three presentations. And I thought I would just pose them back to you. In the meanwhile, let me just make an announcement that there's a group of faculty and university folk who are going to be doing some organizing in a separate room around what we are going to do at the super blocks, at the faculty housing. So maybe Becky, you can put up the link to that Zoom. That's going to be a peel off, and that is going to be separate and is directly inspired by the three of you tonight. So Becky will put that up in just a second. So thank you. So interesting, listening to the both of you, you know, all three of you, very much you get the sense of the challenge of the moment and just how exciting and full of potential the moment seems. And it seems to hinge on, there's a couple questions that I wanted to hear your thinking on. So one is, how do you square, or how do you see going from the here and now and this bringing people along who are trying to make rent and who are going to join the strike, to the big complicated structural change, like Oksana was saying? How do we get from mobilizing people to the rent strike to a discussion about decommodified housing and unpeeling all those stuck interests that are so entrenched in our political system? And the other question I have, which also sort of ran through all the presentations, is related, is who is part of this new coalition that's emerging. One of the things that people in housing justice talk about, the Right to the City, for example, has this framework that housing is an intersectional issue. When you touch housing, you touch all kinds of issues that affect people specifically and differently, but at the same time, you have this tremendous potential for a kind of intersectional alliance. But I was listening, so you have newer tenants, older tenants, you have people in organizations like the DSA, you have people left, right, you have, there's all kinds of other social movements. So I was curious how you see this coalition going forward. So 2 questions for you, can answer any way you like. Long-term versus short-term or strategy kinds of questions, and then the coalition question. How do you see building this out, and how do you touch on these issues?
I can start, but I don't want to be the only answerer. So on the short term, I think the short term and the long term in what you just said is not separate. And I think Sarah talked about it a lot in her remarks. We will have failed in this moment if we don't find a way to absorb all the people who want to cancel rent because they lost their job and use this moment of this material fear and this material this material fear that they have, if we don't use that to politicize them and to build a movement that can welcome those folks, we will have failed. So I really do think it's our job as organizers to really figure out all these folks who weren't open to the housing justice movement before and are open to it now and want to cancel the rent. That's great. I love them and I hope that they stick with us. But it's a moment where the political education around who's impacted by the housing crisis, how has the private real estate market functioned as a way to cement racial and economic inequality over centuries? How is it so fundamentally incapable of winning housing as a human right? Doing that political education, bringing these people into the movement for the longer term and then figuring out how they can see their self-interest in this moment is the job. And I don't actually know that we have figured out a really good way to do that without being able to meet people in person. But I think we're trying to figure it out. We're experimenting and we're hopefully doing an okay job. Some of the things that we're doing, just to name them, is we're having a national Zoom call every Thursday where we're talking about, with the National Homes Guarantee campaign, where we're talking about what are strategies for tenant organizing in this moment. We released the Tenant Organizing Rent Strike Toolkit, which is really not about cancel the rent. It's really about how do you talk to your neighbors in this time of crisis? That's it's not really about rent strikes, even though it is. It's about how do we talk to our neighbors? And how do we give a framework for talking to our neighbors that's politicizing? And we're doing, we're trying to teach a whole bunch of people Zoom. So that is really great. The coalition question is interesting too. I share Sarah's analysis in the CHTU sort of political philosophy here that long-term residents and people of color and low-income renters are particularly and uniquely and most painfully harmed by capitalism and gentrification, but it's the same structure that's impacting all of us, and the only way we win is if we find a way to fight together and build a multiracial, multi-generational tenant and homeless New Yorker movement. And then I think the third thing that is really an organizing challenge, but an important one for me as a coalition organizer in this moment, is that we need to organize new constituencies. So Sex Workers Organizing Project, the Street Vendor Project, New York Renews, BYP 100, these are all organizations that have reached out to me in the last 4 days to say, the Nail Salon Workers Organizing Project, to say our like our industries have shut down, and our members' number one concern is paying the rent. And so it's a moment where we need to be building longer term movement solidarity with like workers centers and with other types of organizing, and get out of our issue silo and like bring in like tons of people into the housing moment. It's like our responsibility to lead in this moment as housing organizers. And so the coalition is big and it is intersectional, but a lot of people are looking to us right now to lead. So I think we need to like take that really seriously and build a coalition that works for all of that, that is durable beyond the next 3 months.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything that Tia said is absolutely true. And I just want to give an example of a situation where there was lots of excitement and a lot of mobilization, and then kind of nothing happened. So my first experience with any kind of like big political movement building was with the anti-Iraq war organizing in 2003. No, sorry, 2003. And there was hundreds of thousands of people who were out on the streets in New York. The biggest mobilization, I think I remember reading somewhere that was some publication that I trusted, it was the biggest mobilization of people in the world at any given time. And then the war happened anyway, and then like that was it. And having read a bunch of postmortems about why that happened, it was the lack of absorption, where we were facing like this huge insurmountable force of like the rolling war machine that was gonna kind of like crush everything, and then it did. So not being able to connect the anti-war movement to a bunch of other types of organizing that was already happening and has been happening in the US for like decades. Yeah, so no plan for absorption, and like lacking the intersectional connection. Yeah, and I trust everyone that is working on this now, that they will be able to do something differently. And obviously it's a completely like the shock that is causing everything to happen now is different. The kind of like the challenges that we're facing are different. So the context is like really important too.
Building on what's just been said, I think, so one thing that's been interesting for me to witness is as we started hosting these spaces for kind of discussion, people certainly starting to question why private property owners have the right to make profits at any cost, right? And these were folks who hadn't necessarily questioned that before, but because they are now the target of it, are starting to question that. And the next step is to show how that's connected to the kind of struggles that working class, Black and brown tenants have already been facing in the city, and how these are connected. And for us, that means, you know, at the CHTU, making sure that in these discussions that we're having, that those voices and those struggles are lifted up and have a stronger role in discussions that are happening. But I think people are questioning, you know, and also like as people confront their landlords, as a lot of young people who never confronted their landlords are starting to confront their like a lot of us are on calls with people just kind of providing therapy for the fact that they have to talk to their landlord. He's harassing them now, you know, and this is a new experience for them, but now they can get on a call with someone who's experienced that for the past 10 years, you know, and they can connect.
Yeah, 100%. It's so interesting, actually. It's like people realizing for the first time that the housing market isn't designed entirely around you. It's funny.
Let me ask a follow-up question. So, and what are we going to do about our elected representatives who are addicted to real estate money, on maybe a little bit even more on the Democrat side, then but what are we going to do about that part? And there's people who've been victorious on this call, so
we're all Cuomo-sexuals now, or whatever they're saying on Twitter. I mean, look, I think the reality is that we need to drive them. We were successful in the rent law campaign because we like drove a very clear distinction. You can't be on the side of real estate and be on the side of the tenant movement. And so we made like a very, like you had to make a choice. You could take real estate money or you couldn't. It's not actually that easy in practice when you get down to the nitty gritty on like what that means, but I think we need to continue to drive that wedge between like the sort of like electoral institutions that like sustain themselves on like property and real estate versus like people, and continue to like force that choice as much as possible. As organizers, I think that's something that we have to do. I think that we are potentially a challenge that we're potentially running up against in this moment is like a lot of politicians who don't totally, who definitely don't even close to totally agree with like our vision for a decommodified housing market are like starting to get that like we're using don't take real estate money as like a test. And so they're like, sure, I'll say that, even though they don't mean it. So we're starting to see like a lot of politicians who are like refusing real estate money, but are not like anywhere close to like sharing our values, which is just a challenge. We're just gonna have to figure out like more tests to like weed out the people who like aren't really with us. Yeah.
There are going to be some questions coming in, and Becky's going to take questions from people on the webinar. So I'm going to step off here, and I wanted to thank you. And one of the things I would love for you to address is a question we get all the time, which is how should students, and what can students do? It's a particular demographic, and it's a specific sector of the housing market. Socially aware and socially justice-oriented students have a lot of questions around this. And so, suggestions for the kinds of things they can do will be really welcome. So, but anyways, I'm going to step off here and just listen to the Q&A and pass it over to Becky.
Thank you, Gianpaolo. Thank you, all of our panelists, for your wise words and your energy, because this is a movement that needs stamina and energy. And your analytical prowess as well. So for people who are interested in Q&A, there are a couple of ways that you can get in touch. You can scroll down to the bottom of your Zoom screen and hover over the bottom and you'll see Q&A and chat. So you can send me a question through chat if you'd like, or you can send me a question through Q&A and I will read it out for our panelists. So we have 2 questions so far that came in during the presentations. And the first one is a really good fundamental question that I think, I think that we talk about this word a lot in our classrooms, but I'm not sure we've ever fully defined it for some of our students. So I hope that somebody will jump in and offer a definition. Can someone explain what austerity is exactly?
So I can start. A simple definition of austerity is cutbacks on public services. So it's things that we all are used to having kind of in the US and much more so in some European and Latin American countries. So things like access to public libraries, like maybe public transit that works, maybe roads that are paved. So austerity pushes those, cuts back the maintenance of those public goods and like public hospitals. And the kind of like more complicated answer to that is the transfer of risk onto individuals away from institutions and away from corporate interests too. So basically while as before you might have been able to have some kind of a social safety net to deal with a crisis, under the regime of austerity, you're not going to have that social safety net anymore, because the public services and the public institutions were cut back repeatedly.
Excellent. Do Sarah or Sia want to add anything? Okay. I have a question from Samuel. I wonder if we know who Samuel is secretly. Here's a question. Hi, everybody. Thanks for these talks. They were very helpful. Sia mentioned two possible futures, one based on the status quo in which foreclosed, abandoned, short-sold multifamily buildings are bought by predatory equity firms, and an alternative future in which either the city, nonprofits, or tenants themselves take control of these same buildings. What do you think are the political meaning movement or legislative actions necessary to secure the good other future, the alternative future, and foreclose on the bad former future?
I can start, and I think others can answer. I'm just going to pull up the question so I can look at it. So I think a bunch of things are necessary. One, and I think it's like a combination of like a little bit like proof of concept, making people believe that this is possible. I think we need to like sort of like revive this idea of like a robust public sector when it comes to investment in housing in a way that we haven't really ever been able to like really fully do. We got like ideology around like how the housing market, it's like we have like deep-seated ideology around on the private housing market. People like all envision themselves to be like future homeowners, even if that may or may not be true. So I think we need to like ignite people's imaginations a little bit into believing that a different world is possible in which like we can live in like really well functioning publicly funded cooperatives or something like that. The good news is in the New York State we've been able to like maintain like well functioning and funded and like sort of nice cooperatives more than like many places have. So I think we need to sort of like lift up the examples throughout history where like this has been possible and like say that it's like possible again. And then the second thing that we need to do is like create a political crisis around the alternative, the foreclosing on the bad future. So we need to like really continue to drive that the people who are in power right now like cannot let the first thing happen. And that's going to be really hard because we have a landlord who's president. So I think like we need to like figure out a way to create that political crisis, and the only way to do that is like mass mobilization of people, and then at the same time like ignite people's imagination to believe that another world is possible, because people are only going to create the political crisis if they believe that they can win. So it's hard, but it's I think we're in a unique moment. I said that already, but I do think it's true.
Thanks. Sarah, Oksana, any thoughts on that question? Okay, we'll move. Oh, Sarah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that Sia's point is exactly right, because there's also, we haven't seen a mass call for kind of like real social housing in the US. And so part of it is also starting to like build towards creating that call and thinking about like direct actions that show that crisis that's already happening. So I think the movements in LA and Chicago that have taken over abandoned or foreclosed homes by homeless individuals or families, those are the kind of actions also, if we could, start building up and making them bigger, are sort of the things that we need to spur the imagination as well.
Yeah, and one thing that I'd like to do, I sort of have thought about in New York, because I think the real estate market in New York has like the real estate market in New York is different than it is in any other city in the country, probably. Even though housing is unaffordable and gentrification is happening everywhere. It's sort of like we're like the center of like global real estate. It's very strange. And so, like, what would it really take to try and get some of the 92,000 homeless individuals who live in New York to like occupy a vacant 421A building on 57th Street in Manhattan? And how would figuring out how we could do such an action, how would that like highlight the contradictions between like the cops who want to protect the real estate and not the people? And I have no idea how we could do anything like that. It sounds like totally terrifying, and like we're not, I don't know. But what they're doing in LA and what they're doing in Oakland and in Chicago, I mean, it's really amazing. And I think that if we could figure out a way to pull something off similar in New York, it could really like show a lot of people at once just how inhumane our real estate market is.
And I think one thing that I would add is, so in like the brief history that the US has existed, there's never been any kind of like mass construction of non-commodified or public or social housing without federal, like lots and lots of federal money. And that's what's been missing from the US housing policy since '72, which is like when things really started shifting under Nixon. Not in terms of like I'm less talking about tactics and strategy about how we get there, but like that piece needs to be there in order for us to build the type of housing that I think that we're talking about. And like places in the world where there are like really big social housing sectors. There's lots of federal money coming in or national money that is going into like both building and also operating that housing.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, we have 3 more questions. If you have time for all of them, we'll see if we can do it. First question is from Lenora Hansen. Does anyone have experience dealing with renters who receive subsidies from their employers for housing or whose landlords are their employers? Are there resources for understanding what a rent strike looks like in that context? And I think, not to read too much into this, but I think this is related to the Zoom call that's happening elsewhere right now. The faculty who are living in NYU housing are trying to organize, and the students, of course, who live in student housing who are also work studies, you know, their housing is subsidized by the university too. So any thoughts on that, any of you?
I feel like Sarah should answer. It looked like you had like an idea in your head.
I mean, there's an interesting parallel to tenants who are housed through kind of nonprofits in private housing. And so this is something that we've been talking about internally because we're organizing in buildings where we have tenants who are paying out of pocket and then tenants who are being paid through these nonprofits. And our idea was we have to figure out a way to leverage the nonprofits at some point to get on our side and withhold. This is slightly different if we're talking about NYU, which is a real estate company in many ways.
Nonprofit.
I don't know. The only thing I can think is like that you would withhold your portion of the rent and that would still have an impact, but I have nothing very smart to say about it. I feel like.
Yeah, another thing that I would think about is like, and I don't also have anything smart to say about it. It's a challenging situation. But it also just reminds me of like the work that we try to do to sort of inoculate against supers and try and like talk to supers who want to undermine tenant associations because they have a very strong like push-pull with like, I need to keep my housing and my employment, but also like my heat's not on too. And like trying to figure out that dynamic. It's not an easy situation, and it's a unique one.
I imagine that in addition to like thinking about like institutions like NYU, this is probably also a question that's coming up for nurses and medical staff who live in hospital subsidized housing as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, again, like I also don't really have, like it's a really, just because, yeah, like it's both your employment and your housing, and it's a really scary situation. But I do think that there's a way in which both public and private hospitals and huge real estate companies that are also universities like Columbia and NYU want to be seen as good corporate citizens and good New York institutions. So there's something about like figuring out if there's a pressure point there of like just public shaming. But that's, you know, like that's like a really scary place to be at.
Yeah, I mean, that's just to add a historical moment or angle, because I'm a historian. I mean, the Pullman strikes in the 19th century, those were all people who were living in company housing. So there's a long history in the labor movement of subsidies or their actual housing, their groceries, their way of life through their companies, and they were finding ways to organize anyway. So anyway, I don't want to say that the NYU faculty should be withdrawing all of their services, but that may be the next step. So I have a couple questions. Another question, Andrea Asprelli asks Sia specifically, can you talk about how close you think we are to getting any kind of rent relief in New York City passed?
Yes, I can. There are about 4 proposals now before the state legislature to do some form of canceling the rent on a various spectrum of constitutional, not constitutional, good for landlords, bad for landlords, good for tenants, temporary. It's like sort of a mess. At the same time, the governor has basically said that he doesn't want the legislature to come back to work at all, which means we have to be pressuring the legislature entirely. I think that it is very likely that we will get some form of rent relief that looks like something in the federal stimulus that will probably come at the end of April or early May. If not that one, the next one. We're going into, it's like what Oksana said, we are going into a period where like the federal government is going to have to bolster states or not for a couple years. So that's going to happen. I will say that it's looking kind of likely that Ilhan Omar will introduce some sort of like rent relief bill that looks like something sometime this week. Something's going to happen, right? And I think it's totally wide open. Like something is going to happen for renters, and it's totally wide open what that will look like. It could very well be like a temporary voucher for people who make like $20,000 a year for 2 months. It could also very well be like a total like cancellation of rent and then like a massive investment in social housing. I would say like equal possibility on either side, and it's really incumbent. Something's going to happen. It's incumbent on us to have it be like as close to the second and like not just like temporary support for people who are going to have much longer like economic loss.
Thank you. Another question from Kazim. With respect to canceling rent, is there any organizing around passing those demands onward in terms of canceling mortgage payments or delaying property tax payments? Is there an organizing possibility that includes some property owners and drives a wedge between speculative landlords and small-scale building owners worried about mortgage and property tax payments?
I mean, we're calling to cancel mortgages too. I'm very hesitant to call for property taxes. We are hesitant to call to suspend property taxes in a moment when we need money more than ever. If there's not enough money coming from the federal government, there's not enough money coming from the state government. We need our property taxes. We just need them. Our property tax system is deeply inequitable and fucked up. Excuse my language. But I do want to think about like fixing that problem without further harm, like further stressing our resources. But yeah, we are calling for a mortgage suspension.
Which Cuomo was happy to offer before he was ever thinking about renters. Okay.
People love property owners. Like our entire political system is structured around property owners.
Right, of course.
Which includes writing down property taxes. Like I will say it's totally unfair that many landlords don't pay property taxes and many, many other people do.
Right, of course. Okay, last week, the state's Court of Appeals sided with landlords in a lawsuit to strike down a section of the new rent laws on retroactive rent overcharge claims, which left a lot of rent stabilized tenants without important legal grounds or more limited grounds for their case in Section F. New tenant laws, I believe, will come out in June. What are the chances this will or can be overturned? Is there a movement forming against this appeal?
So I know that this is something that people are discussing, but it seems like given the composition of the higher court after the one that like above the Court of Appeals, it's going to be very difficult to getting this overturned.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's probably like the fourth worst thing that happened last week. Last week was bad.
Yeah. And the bail reform too was reversed.
Oh yeah, last week was just like
bad week.
Thing after thing. It was not good.
All right, so I have one last question, if I may indulge your time, and we have 5 minutes left anyway. This is from Ariel, who works for UHAB, by the way. I have a question. How can we get to a point of mass rent refusal / strike? Is that necessary? How many strikes do you think we need to hit a tipping point for a political crisis or response? What are the risks or how do we connect these to the long-term goals and not the real estate profiting from foreclosures, et cetera?
That is the $1 million question.
Yeah.
We all know the answer.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess this has kind of been a thread running through the discussion tonight as people are becoming more alert to housing precarity for themselves and their neighbors. And they're finding ways to connect to movements in a way that they hadn't before. You just mentioned, Sia, earlier about your mailing list growing exponentially. So, and the Zoom calls that Sarah was talking about are, huge numbers of people showing up. So, so that's crisis and disaster foment activism. So maybe this is what it takes.
I think that's right. And I think it will be a combination of the building level rent strikes that the Crown Heights Tenant Union is working on. And I think that we would be doing an amazing job if we got 15 to 30 big buildings on a rent strike in New York State. But behind that, we've got, hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers individually agreeing not to pay the rent. I think that the first is a sort of more traditional rent strike that's really built in the trust and the solidarity that you need to actually sustain a rent strike. I think that the second track where we have individuals really not paying the rent and pledging not to pay the rent, I think that is much less durable. That will last for the duration of the crisis, but those folks who are not engaging in collective struggle with their neighbors in a face-to-face way, and I could totally be wrong about this. We're learning how to be digital organizers right now, but our theory right now is we can get 15 to 30 buildings that are on a traditional rent strike with their neighbors, deeply in collaboration with one another, doing the work that the Crown Heights Tenant Union is building. And that behind that, we have got hundreds of thousands of individuals who have pledged to stand in solidarity with them and not pay the rent in April and May and June or whatever for the duration of the crisis. And that combination of those two factors will create something of a political crisis. We also are trying to figure out how we can target for the first category, the tier 1 category, the folks that are in Cuomo's donor friend class. He has landlords he likes the most. But this is just our theory. We're testing it out right now. So please stay tuned. And then the last thing I will say is rent strikes are risky. There are tons of risks to going on a rent strike. Nobody ever won anything if they didn't take risk. So people should not be like going into this moment expecting it's going to be easy, but it's already not easy. So if your alternative is like not paying rent by yourself because you lost your job, or like not paying rent with 100,000 other people, like this option is safer than this option. So
yeah.
I don't know.
Oksana or Sarah, do you want to add a last comment?
Yeah, I mean, there are, rent strikes are really risky, but to just reiterate what Sia said, it is really different if you're doing it in a moment where you have hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of people going on rent strike. And, you know, at CHGU, we think the rent strike is the only way we're going to get politicians to really do a close to universal cancel rent. Because means tested means so many people are going to be left out. And this is, as one of our long-term members said, we have one shot, and this is it, and we better get it right. So that's what we're working for.
I totally feel that way. It's really scary.
Hovering over the.
Yeah, and I think this part of the scary thing is that lots of people don't have a choice, right? Like there's, it's gonna keep on rolling and it's gonna get worse, and lots of people are not gonna be able to pay their rent. So if there's an opportunity to kind of like stand in solidarity with people and do something that will kind of like address the underlying problem that existed this whole time all along. Yeah, like people like Sia and Sarah have been building kind of like an infrastructure for us to be able to do that over the last more than a couple of years, a long time. So yeah, I think it's important to acknowledge that the reason why any possibility for things to happen now, even if they're kind of like difficult to envision, are because organizing has already been happening for a long time in the city.
And so that's the end of our questions. And with that, I want to thank you. That's a wonderful way to end, actually, Oksana, because we're really grateful for the kinds of foundations that you've been building and the historical foundations of all the rent strikes past and hope and maybe future that have created these kinds of movements. I want to, again, thank you all for coming, the panelists and our audience members. I just posted something on the chat, another link, which is a link to the event that we're co-sponsoring next Tuesday. That event is co-sponsored with the Department of Labor Studies from CUNY and also NYC DSA and also Verso Books. And it's really exciting because it's a moment to bring together a global perspective on the housing justice movement. So Raquel Rolnick, who Jean-Paulo mentioned earlier, was the UN rapporteur on housing a couple of years ago. So she'll be speaking, and Daniel Aldana Cohen, who is one of our great theorists of the Green New Deal. And our friend Sia will be there as well. So we hope that you'll join us. If you forget this link and you don't copy it and you don't link to it right now, we will send it out again. And we'll also just suggest that you subscribe to the Urban Democracy Lab's website or mailing list through the homepage, and you'll get all of our emails. So thanks so much again. Yay. And we are done. We'll see you later.